As season 2 of Arcane is about to release, we checked out season 1 of the acclaimed fantasy series. Is it one of the best video game adaptations in recent times? Let's talk about it.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are back. The Eye of the Storm podcast. We're just going to get straight into it. Hervey, can you let the people know what we're going to be discussing today?
So today we're talking about Arcane Season 1. Now, this is a series that I love and I've watched many, many times. And Daniel was only watching for the first time. And just as a bit of a background for anyone that hasn't watched it before, it's a animated series based on the League of Legends games. And it's about this one city where there's this kind of class divide where you have sort of like the upper class that seems to have everything, and then this sort of lower sort of city or the undercity as they're called in the show, who are kind of like trodden down, beaten down, etc. And it tells the tale of sort of these two sisters who find themselves on opposing sides of this sort of class war between sort of Piltover and the nation of Zaun, with Piltover being sort of the upper class and the nation of Zaun being sort of the undercity. And within that, there's many different sort of fascinating characters and storylines that all intertwine to tell sort of this one culminative story with an explosive ending to season 1. And of course, season 2 is coming out in about a week or so. So with that said, Daniel, this is your first time watching Arcane season 1. So do you want to give us your initial impressions?
Yeah, so I first tried to watch this about a year ago and really bounced off hard the first episode. And it was one of those things that I always wanted to revisit because everybody's been telling me how amazing it is. And I never could get past the beginning. And so for this, I rewatched it in its entirety. And I'm glad I did, because I think it really picks up in the 4th episode and just keeps getting better from there. So while I have some issues with the story and the world building and stuff like that, and I think there's a little bit too much melodrama for my taste, I think this is a really good story. Like you can recognize its influences from the game in there, but they just crafted a story on top of those ideas and told a really good story overall.
One of the things that I loved about this was the story. Like, the story completely hooked me from, actually, I'll be real, like, for me as well, it took me 2 attempts to actually get into this. And I do agree, like, the first 1 or 2 episodes does take some time to kind of get into, because you're just being introduced to the characters and you're sort of they're setting the essential foundations for the world, essentially. But like you said, everything from there sort of kind of like picks up. One thing you did mention was like kind of like the melancholic kind of like type of tone that the sort of story has.
Melodrama,
so yeah. So why
talking
was
about their feelings way too much, but yeah.
why was that kind of like a bit of a contention point for you?
So there's like this type of storytelling that's really popular in recent years, where characters talk about their feelings, but it's like at full intensity the entire time.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's not, there's no build up, there's no rising tension, falling tension, there's no, like, it's not tempered by the plot or where those characters actually are. It's just full intensity all the time. Every single idea and every single line is the most profound one ever. Like if you've ever seen a World of Warcraft cutscene, you know what I'm talking about. And this kind of had touches of this. And I think it's just a type of, like a style of writing that's really popular among a bunch of current writers. And I have a really hard time like taking it seriously, because it's not like driven by character moments. It's just made to sound profound, right? And this has a little bit of that. It's not too much. It doesn't ruin it, but it's got a little bit of that. And that's just something that I just kind of had to push through.
Do you not feel that it provides some actually really great quotable moments from the series? So like one in particular that really stands out is between Victor and Jace's character, where he says, where they're kind of like, I believe it's in like episode 8 or something like that, where they're talking about sort of kind of in the pursuit of trying to do great, they fail to do good, essentially, and stuff like that. Kind of like pouring out sort of how they're feeling in that time. And then there was another example of it, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But that was like one that really stuck out to me, was that particular quote.
There are certainly good character moments in this, right? So, and there's a whole bunch of confrontations or just dialogues between multiple characters where they really come to a head. And like I don't have a problem with that happening. It's just, there's this style of writing that kind of dialogue where it's just all equally epic without it being motivated by the situation. But if it is motivated by the situation, it is justified by where that character is based on plot and their emotional state and so on, then I think it totally works. It's just this kind of leaned into that a little bit. And I think it would be stronger if they kind of tempered it a little bit more. But that's my only concern about that.
That's fair. And you did mention that you did enjoy the story overall. What was it in particular about kind of like how the story unfolded across the season that sort of kind of really grabbed you, especially you say from episode 4 onwards?
So the thing that really interested me was this whole idea of hex tech creating a new status quo and like a new era that changes the rules, and different people are impacted by this change differently, and not everybody is going to be better off by it and so on. Like it's kind of like an industrial revolution kind of thing, but with magic. And like this whole idea of why Piltover was founded, and how some people think it went too far, some people think it didn't go far enough in rejecting magic, and they kind of allude to the context in which that happens. Like we don't see really the devastation that came from use of magic in this world, but it's stated multiple times, right, that this is why Piltover is the way it is, and that's why magic is not allowed. And I think that whole thing really worked. Like when the council was trying to decide which way to take Piltover, and Jace and Victor kind of tried to push the envelope and thought we can use magic for good, and other people said no, you can never use magic for good, and there were other people in the middle. Like that entire thing I think really worked.
I think what the series does really well, actually, it kind of shows it does really well to show you both sides of it. So especially with like the hex tech, in the opening episodes when Jinx steals one of those the little gemstones. In one episode, you're seeing Jace and Victor kind of like pushing the boundaries of science, kind of like cultivating it and developing, these things to benefit other people's lives in the city. But then on the flip side, they also show you the devastation of the hex tech, magic, in terms of, especially in episode 3, where Jinx is trying to save her friends and save her father, etc. And then she sets off the gemstone, which causes this massive explosion and causes all of her friends to die and this, that, and the other. So I think throughout the series, it does really well to kind of show you both sides of it, and it shows you some of the possibilities. It shows you the good that can come from it, and it shows you some of the bad that can come from it. And likewise with a lot of the violence and the fighting in this as well, it's it kind of suckers you in with some of the action and some of the set pieces, but then it will show you some of the devastating effects, or some of the ripple effects, and how other people are affected from the fighting as well. Again, most notably in episode 8, when you've got Jace taking it upon himself to go and destroy some of these shimmer mines, and then he ends up killing that small boy. So it kind of shows you the realities of war, or the casualties of war. So I think it does that really well, this show.
If anything, it doesn't really show the upside of hex tech, right? They show the hex tech gates, and they talk about how it's enabled continental trade and stuff like that, right? But we don't really see anybody benefit from this, right? We don't see and you could show people from the Undercity having jobs for the first time in years, because all this boom in trade means that you need people to do the work, right? Stuff, or whatever, or somebody gets injured and because of hex tech the injury can be cured or something like that. I don't remember anything like that happening, right? Or am I wrong about that?
Not explicitly. I think what they were showing was, again, like you mentioned about the hex gates and the booming the trade and stuff like that. But it also showed how they were continuously trying to develop new things. So the mining gloves that they were trying to develop, so that people that were working in the Undercity were able to mine more efficiently and more safely with the gloves that they were developing. So it was showing the possibilities of it, and I think it lent a little bit more so on the devastation of the technology, as opposed to showing the upside of it. And I think it kind of fit a little bit more into the story, but it was kind of sprinkled in there, in my opinion.
Yeah, I just wished it had this kind of leads into my biggest problem with the series, which is that it doesn't really set up an interesting conflict between Topside and the Undercity, right? They just say that people in the Topside are exploiting people in the Undercity and treating them like subhuman and all of that. So we don't really see why this inequality exists, and we don't really see why the tension exists, right? We don't really see why the Undercity doesn't just go do its own thing. And towards the end, there's talk about secession, right, where they want to become their own nation. And I don't understand why anybody has a problem with that, really, right? If there's such a burden, if there's such a danger, if the Topsiders don't actually want to govern the Undercity, right? Because it's too dangerous and it's too polluted and all of that. Why do they not simply leave them alone, right? Like, I was expecting something along the lines of, I don't know, maybe Hextech has made a lot of labor like redundant, and now the Undercity has fallen into poverty. But it's like that from the first episode, right? So I don't know. Like, I think a lot of this whole conflict between the two factions or the two sides, I think, could have been more compelling if there was like a reason for why this happened, because like the council seems to be pretty much motivated by good ideas, right? They want to create a utopia. They want to create, like, and unless they're just supposed to be hypocrites.
I think one, it's kind of shown that the councillors are very they put their self-interest first, especially when it comes to some of the things like the trade, where anytime there's like the threat of like closing the hex gates, they're all like kind of concerned about like their own like self-interest in that side of things. And I think there's also a line which kind of like encapsulates something of what you're saying, that's said by Caitlin, where she says about just because they're not your preferred constituents doesn't mean that, like, you know, I can't remember exactly how the line goes, but she says something about like them just not being their preferred constituents. It's essentially, it kind of like mirrors real life, where you have like the government that sort of put their investments or they put sort of their resources behind sort of certain parts of the sort of the country that they're governing, and then there's always people that are left behind. There's always people that are just not sort of invested in, or like the areas aren't invested in, essentially. And I feel like that's like a true representation here. It's not like, you know, say like the UK, again, you have like cities up north or whatever that kind of have been left behind, haven't had sort of much of the funding that sort of somewhere like London would have in the UK. And I feel like it doesn't need to be an explicit reason for why. It just might be because sort of Piltover, which is sort of the thriving part of the actual overall city, is just where the resources is being pulled without sort of there needs to be a reason why they haven't invested. And to your point as well about sort of why they don't just let them be their own nation, their own sort of nation. Part of it is also just about sort of having control and having power over sort of certain things, and not wanting to relinquish that and sort of give that up.
They still don't want to lose that grip over them. And I think also another reason why it didn't go into kind of like the beef between the two is because I think this animation was like mainly character focused. I think it was building up to that. It was going to build up to that, and I wouldn't be surprised if they do that in season 2, where we actually do see the two clash even more. But I do agree, Daniel, where you come from, because I think it's a thing where even though season 2 we might see more of that, at the same time they should have showed it in season 1 to kind of like it's missing a story. It's like we're just going to jump in straight to the beef, whereas we're not going to know fully like the backstory as to why the beef started. So I do understand where you're coming from, but I just think this one mainly was like character focused and just like, you know, the character arcs and the development of it, which I thought was really, really good, by the way.
Just to add to that as well, I feel like, you know, the point in time in which they kind of chose to sort of show this as well was after a civil war had just ended as well. You know, if you remember back to some of the opening of season 1, it's kind of like showing some of the ending, or like towards the end of like the initial civil war that they had, and they showed kind of like Vander with his gloves and the enforcers and the Undercity kind of clashing, and then it's just like his realization of like the cost of going to war and like the people that are being lost, etc. And I think it's sort of emphasized throughout that there is tension and there is like people in the Undercity that are sort of like trodden down and sort of want to rebel and want to fight back and kind of want their independence. But, you know, Vander is very much the peacekeeper. He's seeing the cost of war, essentially not willing to lose more people in this sort of in the name of kind of like going to war with Piltover. So he tries to like manage as best as he can and try to sort of keep the peace and try to like keep the people like going and thriving whilst sort of essentially trying to keep the peace with sort of Piltover. And then once he's gone, you have sort of Silco, who's kind of like pushing the boat a little bit and sort of clawing for a little bit more power and sort of wanting to do what he can to sort of kind of get back at sort of Piltover. So I think what season 1 does well, like Jonathan says, it's like a lot more character focused, but it does sort of show a lot of like the tension and sort of some of like the some of the build up towards what we're probably going to get in season 2 of sort of the top side versus sort of the Undercity.
Yeah, I just think it would have been a more interesting story if there had been an actual conflict or dilemma in the relationship between those two, as opposed to the topsiders just being elitist jerks, right? And especially since a lot of the character conflicts are driven by like which side they pick in that debate, right? And so if there had been an actual choice to make or something like that, I think that would have made for a stronger story.
Onto the characters. So of course this was mainly focused on Vi and Powder / Jinx in the story. How invested were you in their sort of kind of like their story development throughout the season? You know, do you think did it work for you?
So I think the rift between the two sisters was really well done. Anything after that, I had a little bit less interest, mostly because Jinx didn't seem to have a goal really. Like she was just apparently so broken by that experience she had as a child that she was, I don't know, maybe I need to watch it again, but she didn't seem to be doing anything interesting or pursuing any real interesting goal, whereas Vi was constantly just trying to kind of get through to her, but that was impossible from the start, it seemed. So I was much more interested in Victor and Jace, and basically their attempt to kind of reform the council and try to steer them towards better path. But like the Vi and Jinx conflict is clearly the center of it. But I don't know, I especially in the second half, I had a hard time really caring because Jinx was so incoherent. And she was supposed to be, right? I think the acting was really great for Jinx. It's just because she was acting so erratically and was so broken, I had a hard time really caring about it. And it also meant that Vi's attempts were kind of doomed from the start, I think. Like I didn't really see a scenario in which Vi would succeed in getting through to her sister, and that kind of made it hard to care about. Whereas, you know, the other characters, like the other stories, kind of had more going on, I thought.
I get where you're coming from. I think the reason why, for me personally, I think Jinx did kind of like have. It's not that she had a purpose or goal, but technically speaking, because I think Jinx was pretty much trauma, right? And she was kind of like stuck in a loop. And I think the whole relationship dynamic between her, Silco, and her sister, it was like her sister represented the light and Silco represented the darkness. So that creates like some sort of loop where it was like she was constantly being pulled back and forth. And it was like, I think her purpose and her goal was kind of like, I think her story was, is she going to end up in the light or is she going to end up in the darkness? And obviously, for me, that's what made it interesting, because that's what kind of like raised the stakes. It's like, okay, who's she gonna go with? Because on the one hand, you saw what her sister did. Like her sister isn't like, even though I'm saying she was the light and she was the darkness, because she was the light because she's pretty much someone that's trying to pull Jinx back into, you know, the good side. But at the same time, she caused her to go into the darkness with what she did in the beginning by kind of like, you know, getting angry at her when she was a kid and pretty much told her to leave. And then obviously you got Silco, where, you know, he's pretty much causing her to do the bad stuff, but at the same time, you can tell that he genuinely loves her as a daughter. So I think that's where like the dilemma comes in. That dilemma is what made her story so interesting, and especially the way that they had her kind of like portray trauma through like, and this is the animation. That's one of the reasons why I was hella surprised when I was watching this, because before I think Arcane is what got me back into animation. It was just the character development and just the way that trauma, with just not Jinx but everyone else, the way trauma was kind of like conveyed in this series. I was like, it's crazy, like through facial expressions, even though the visuals are amazing, but through like facial expressions and like even the certain things, like you see scars, and then the way that you see scars in different characters, and obviously that, and then it kind of like goes through backstories and just different stories. Even like the people that weren't main characters, they had their like own interesting story arc, which they pretty much had significance as well, even though they weren't the main characters. So I think, yeah, me personally, I think Jinx was like my favorite, because it was like she was in a tug of war situation between light and darkness, and the way that trauma was revealed through like her, you know, her hallucinations. And
I think like a lot of her drive was a sense of like belonging and a sense of sort of being sort of part of some type of family, and sort of she had a lot of like abandonment issues in this particular show, and you can kind of see in terms of like how she behaves with sort of Silco, in terms of when she gets like reprimanded in episode 4 for sort of the mishap that happens on the sort of the trade ship. Her response to that is, I need to do something to get back in his good graces. And, you know, you kind of see lots of things like that. And that's how he essentially manipulates her into doing what he wants in terms of like kind of like telling her that like no one else cares about her, only he loves her, this, that, and the other, constantly just like manipulating her. I understand like in terms of like her ultimate motivation, there wasn't like anything like that she wanted to achieve essentially for herself, but just like that kind of like dynamic, like Jonathan was saying, in terms of like just like her dealing with like this trauma and sort of, and I think they did enough as well to kind of sprinkle in. I know you didn't see that like that she would eventually be sort of brought back to the light by Vi, but I think they did well to kind of sprinkle in a little bit in there to show that Powder was still in there, and that sort of there was this attachment still to sort of to Vi in her previous life, even though it was kind of like contorted and sort of kind of like messed up in sort of the mindset that she was in during the show. Like Jonathan was saying, just like the way that they were portraying a trauma and stuff like that, it was just like excellently handled for me in that sense. That's why it kept me kind of like engaged in their story, and that's why it had like that emotional investment, especially when they had like that first reunion in episode 6 when they hadn't seen each other for sort of a few episodes. And I think it added a lot of weight to the end of the end of the season as well, episode 9, when they're having sort of a conversation around sort of that little tea party that she sort of hosts for everyone that that she has some type of thing against.
And I think that's what made it great as well, in terms of like the build up to that is the reunion between her and her sister. That's something which I was that's something that I was looking forward to. And in order for me to look forward to that, everything previous to that has to be interesting. You know what I'm saying? So for me, it was like everything that they did previous to that reunion was just right, because I was so emotionally invested. I was just waiting. I can't wait to see what's going to happen between Jinx and her sister, because of everything that they've just shown in terms of backstories and the build up to that, and in terms of like the direction that Jinx was going into. Because she was literally turning into a mad woman. I could tell. I could see that she was going to turn into like, before the reunion, I could see that she was going to turn into like one of the biggest threats in the actual series, and I wanted her to become one of the biggest threats in the actual series. Yeah. I love Jinx. She even became my DP.
Just lastly, before we kind of touch on some of the other characters in this, just kind of like round up on Jinx and stuff like that. What did you think about like the dynamic between like her and Silco in this as well? And actually, what did you think about the ending of episode 9? Because I know that you're not a fan of like things culminating into like one big sort of action set piece just for the sake of it being an action set piece. And I think in this one, it was more kind of like a little bit like more psychological in terms of sort of trying to sort of see where Jinx will land in this and sort of the conversation between like her, Silco, and sort of and Vi, and sort of where she would sort of sit within that. So yeah, what was your thoughts on the dynamic between her and Silco, and obviously how it rounded out in episode 9?
So I think Silco is definitely an interesting character. He kind of has one foot in each of the major storylines, right? On the one hand, there's the political stuff with the council and everything, and the independence of. So what is currently the Undercity will become the nation of Zaun. Is that right?
Yeah, I said we'll see, because Jinx might have messed it up.
And then he's also got a foot in the whole story with Jinx and this just general attempt of the people in the Undercity to find some kind of belonging, right? Where they kind of are looking for somebody to lead them, to give them a better way. And it all kind of hangs together, I think. And I think that's really interesting. So on that basis, you never really know just how sincere he is. And I never really got a good handle on who is he playing exactly, and where is he actually sincere until he actually does something. So I thought that was also really well done.
And then end of episode 9, the tea party.
And then the very end. So I've got to admit, I don't have a perfect handling on that, right? During the final confrontation, Jinx kind of accepts that that Powder is dead, essentially, and that she is no Jinx, right? And so her decision is to kind of use the hex tag to destroy the council, right?
Yeah.
Why does she do that?
It was more just before that, in terms of like how the conflict resolution kind of like played out between like her, Silco, and Vi, and sort of kind of the ultimate decision that she made, and sort of her killing Silco and this, that, and the other. Like how do you? Because that's kind of sort of one thing that you're normally looking for is just how the climax of the story is resolved in a way that's not generic and sort of not overplayed.
Yeah, no, I thought it brought all of those threads really well together, right? You've got Vi's attempt to get through to Jinx. You've got Jace's attempt to use Hextech to help people and to find another way, right? And you've got Silco's attempt to kind of get recognition for his side. And you've got Jinx's kind of internal struggle of kind of having to pick one of her personalities, essentially, right? That's more or less what's going on in that scene, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, it all comes really. I thought it really comes together, and I just don't like pointless fights, right? Just a fight for the sake of a fight. And I thought that fight scene where everybody kind of becomes their real self, right? Vi gets her gauntlets, and Jace gets his hammer, and Jinx has to make a choice, and Silco's true colors come out. It all comes together in that scene, and then the pieces fall where they fall. So I thought that was a really good ending.
Do you want to touch on some of the other characters? 'Cause I know you mentioned you were more invested in the kind of like Jason Victor story in this.
Yeah, so a lot of this comes down to taste. Like a story about family and personal trauma is just not what I am all that interested in. I'm much more interested in like the whole thing about the invention of Hextech and how that changes like the political situation in Piltover and what that means for different characters and why they choose different paths in that situation. That's just generally something I'm more interested in. It's not about it being like better made or something like that. It's more like that's where my interest is, right? I always really like woke up when like Jace and Victor and Heimerdinger were on screen and were kind of trying to find a better way and kind of reform Piltover kind of from the inside. And also, I think one thing that really stood out to me was kind of Jace's naivete, where he keeps trying to fix things and he doesn't really think it through, and there's always side effects and consequences that he didn't anticipate. And he's kind of frustrated with this because he just wants everybody to work together. That's something that really caught my interest.
And it really speaks to his character as well. I think there's when you watch it like a second time, you kind of like pick up on some of the small things, and it's really funny. And like in the early episodes, you have Echo's character who sort of says about like the guy from Piltover who came in and didn't even haggle about like the price of everything in the shop, and they charge him double. And then that then later ties into the conversation that he had with Silco, where the negotiating the peace term, and then Silco says like the boy didn't even haggle, like he was able to kind of like get everything he wanted. And obviously he then has a conflict of whether he gives up Jinx for like his like ultimate goal essentially. But I feel like again, like it was like quite interesting to kind of like see how he was being manipulated, etc., until it eventually got to that really last point where he approaches the council and says like, okay, this is what I've done, and he finally doesn't care about like how they feel, or doesn't care about some of their opinions anymore, and being true to some of what he wants to do and like himself. And I feel like his character development throughout that was like very, very fascinating, very like interesting in that sense. And I feel likewise for Victor as well. Just like Victor was very tragic for me in the sense of like you have this this crippled person from the Undercity that's kind of done everything that he can to work his way out of there, and is literally all about just like scientific improvement and scientific development. And that's all he's passionate about. It's just like the improvement of life, etc. And then that just kind of like leads him down this darker path, which you don't initially foresee for him. That's another thing that I think the show does really well as well, is that every character action and every character choice doesn't come from left field. It's kind of like built upon what's established for the character and what their belief is. But yeah, I think that's excellent, like really well done in terms of like his kind of character progression and like where he ends up in his story as well.
Do you feel like, because before Arcane, I'm not really too familiar with animation before Arcane, right? So that came out 2 years ago, I swear.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So before that, because one thing I was surprised about this animation was it was very mature, and it came out the West, which is something which I was really surprised about. I tend to feel like the West, just even with live action movies, they don't really make a lot of like serious toned, mature type of stuff. You can tell it's very flavored down, watered down, and it's like more of a universal content. Whereas this one felt very itty-gritty, so it felt very realistic, which is surprising because it was an animation. But yeah, it just felt like it was for a mature audience. Before Arcane, because was animation like that? And were you surprised, especially you, Daniel and Hervé, were you both surprised like at what you were watching, that it was pretty much like a very serious toned adult themed animation? Because after that there was Blue Eyed Samurai, which I really liked, and that had like an adult theme, so I started to see more adult themed type of animations. So was Arcane like the trigger of everything, if it was the first of its kind? And if it wasn't, then please plug me onto more.
So animation in the West, I think there's less of it compared to like especially Japan and some others, especially when it comes to serious stuff not for children, right? I wasn't really surprised because like I've been watching animation for decades, and like there's plenty of serious stuff that is actually for adults and has stuff going on. Yeah, from the West. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'm actually not terribly into Japanese animation. Mostly, like I've tried a couple, and like the storytelling conventions and the character designs and the storylines just are not really my thing. I've tried a couple of things and just nothing's clicked. So like even in Western animation, there is stuff that isn't for children or that isn't just a comedy or just wacky hijinks, but it's actually, I don't have too many examples off the top of my head, but it does happen. And so the fact that this was animation didn't strike me as anything too unusual. I think it's just, I think what is unusual is that like it seems fairly high budget, and it seems like a really earnest attempt by Riot Games to kind of sell people who aren't playing the game on their characters. I think that's why this is happening. And that is why they put so much money and effort into it and they took it so seriously. Because it wasn't just somebody who thinks that animation is for children, it was somebody who knows these characters because they created them, and they want to kind of elevate those characters beyond the game, I think. And I think on that level, it's really succeeded because you don't, like, having played the game, not in recent years, but I have played it, I recognize a whole bunch of little things, but you don't need to have played the game to understand this show. I think that is this, like, kind of the intent and strategy behind it. But it's not, I don't think it's unique. I think what is unusual about it is budget and scope and the amount of notoriety it's gotten, but it's not the first of its kind or anything like that.
Well, then, if you guys got more that's like similar to Arcane in terms of like the adult theme and the grittiness, then please let me know after this. And for you people that's watching, let me know in the comment down section below, please.
We kind of touched on the story and character a lot, which is like a lot of the main focus in this. But was there any other aspect of this that you kind of like really stood out to you? I know you mentioned about like the animation stuff being big budget and stuff like that, but you know, what other things kind of made you hold this in high regard?
It might be the best fantasy epic or fantasy story in recent years, because like all the other ones have had their problems, right? I'm talking about things like Game of Thrones and The Witcher and others, and none of them have really lived up to their potential in the sense that the stories eventually fall apart. And this is a very complex story with lots of characters. There's a lot going on in the story. And I don't think all of it works. Like, and we've talked about some of those things where I'm not entirely sold on it, but it is a functioning story, right? It is like, it's not a mess at all, right? Like everything is very focused on high quality, and there's no, and you know, maybe if this runs for 5 seasons or whatever, maybe there will be some seams, but you know, it was refreshing at how it was just a story that somebody told and it worked. And especially in fantasy, that is something that is rare, if not unique. Yeah. I can't think of any in recent years that have really stuck the landing on this.
Season 2 is the final season of this.
It is the final, okay. But they could tell many stories in this universe, right? Yeah. So they said something about spin-offs?
Yeah, so the plan is that because they've got like so many characters, is that this is going to be the conclusion of Jinx and Vi's story. I think they did mention that some characters within this might get their own stories or might appear again in other stories. But for this particular story, and I think that's probably the right approach as well, is that you have this concise story. You don't need to drag it out for sort of 4 or 5 seasons. You've got a rich world to kind of like dig into and sort of tell multiple different stories from, you know, different perspectives. So I think they're making the right approach on that sense. And you know, just to kind of like lean into the story again in this, what I really appreciate as well is how all the different sort of stories and all the different subplots kind of like really come together to fit the overarching or sort of the overall story that they're sort of telling in this. And like every individual story has an impact, whether it's sort of like minor or whether it's sort of major, has some type of influence on sort of what's happening in other sort of other stories and sort of and it's affecting the other world. So, you know, most notably, obviously, you know, this is an obvious one, but when sort of Jace orders sort of the blockade of some of the bridges, and then that then has the knock-on effect of sort of the Undercity and sort of it pausing trade, and then that then has the knock-on effect of sort of Silka having to deal with sort of the drug baron to feel that he's like losing control and stuff like that. And I just feel like that was just like excellently done in terms of just like how, you know, all the stories just had some type of effect on sort of everything else that was going on in the world in this.
Oh yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, it's very complex, but it also moves at a decent pace, and all the pieces kind of feed into each other, like you said. Yeah, so that's definitely one of its strong points. And I think it being a 2-season story may help with that as well, where you don't have to wait 5 years to figure out what the relevance of some character is or something. The one problem maybe I have with this, it seems a bit like a prequel, because, and I don't just mean the first 3 episodes, which probably could be much shorter, because it seems like that's a different story, or like it's the setup for the story, but spending 3 episodes on it might be a bit much. But what I mean is, if you know the game, then you can see kind of like the foundations of these different characters, but they're not like in the game. Like Vi, for instance, gets her gauntlets by the end of the season, for example. And that's one of those things that you recognize from the games, but not all characters are like this, right? A lot of characters are kind of seeded and are kind of like a more basic, more like less fantastical version of what you know. And maybe that can be a little bit frustrating when you watch it. I don't know. Like it just stuck out to me that there were a lot of characters like this, like maybe too many. And it didn't break the story or anything, but it's just one thing I noticed.
Yeah, no, I for sure, and I think it's, you know, for anyone that has played the games and is sort of familiar with the characters, because like a lot of what I heard as well was that, you know, Jinx and Vi weren't even some of the most popular characters, you know, from the series as well. You know,
I think Jinx is pretty popular, but Vi not. Like Vi is kind of in the middle.
I think maybe more of a gripe for, you know, people that have played the game, but for, you know, people that haven't played the game, you know, it's less of an obvious thing. And I think you sort of kind of touched on it, Daniel, in the sense that it doesn't really break the story. It's just more of a nice little Easter egg if some of the other characters sort of kind of like realize their full potential. And maybe you might see it in sort of season 2, where I believe they're kind of leading out to this sort of all-out war. There's like been heavy marketing emphasis on Medarda's mum, Councillor Medarda's mum, and like something like her presence, and obviously she's got like the military background, and so she's, you know, kind of gone through and
Sorry, I was confused about that. Like they're politicians from different countries, right? Like the mother is like a leader in Noxus, which is another nation.
Another nation, yes, yeah.
How does that work? Do they say?
I was a little bit. I'm trying to remember it as well, because like it does feel strange, because it feels like when you're on Piltover, you're on like a whole world in itself. But I do believe, you know, because obviously they are trading with other cities, because Piltover is kind of described as a city in this, essentially. So I feel like she's a leader from a different city, and like she is a person that kind of maybe sort of invades other sort of kind of like countries or cities and stuff like that. Like
Noxus is, I think, known for being quite warlike and aggressive, like the conquerors of the setting, I think. And so it was a little bit strange that you had this council member whose mother is a leader in a hostile nation, but she comes and goes as she wants. Maybe season 2 will expand on this, but that's an aspect where I said, wait a second, how does this work? But I actually liked her. Like I liked the mother a lot, because she had like an outside perspective, but was not afraid to articulate it, right? And she was constantly setting people straight, but in a way that made sense, because pretty much all the characters are pretty young. So kind of having a more experienced perspective in there, where she essentially points out people's mistakes, but in a way that makes sense and is probably correct, was kind of interesting, especially because she doesn't have a dog in this fight at all, right? Like what happens to Piltover doesn't really seem to matter to her, as far as I could tell.
She just wants the weapons. She just wants the weapons to kind of like support the cause that she has. Essentially, she talks about, you know, this guy that's after her because like they've crossed her own person, essentially. So that's kind of her like interest, and obviously like her daughter as well is like her sort of vested interest in this as well. But no, she was like a great late addition as well, because it added a lot of context to sort of Councillor Medarda's character as well, in terms of like how she operates and how she thinks, and you can kind of see some of the teachings sort of that she received from her mother into some of the actions that she sort of does, and sort of the way that she approaches things. But you can also see that she's like, she has a different heart to what sort of her mother has. So that was kind of a really good sort of late addition to the story. But moving on to season 2, what are your expectations, or what are you kind of hoping for season 2?
I mean, the obvious one is the fallout from the council being destroyed, right? Mm-hmm. And I imagine that would create some kind of power vacuum, and that probably lead to some kind of uprising in the Undercity, would be my guess. I guess that's the immediate fallout of that, right?
Yeah, for sure. And for some of your favorite characters, where do you kind of see them falling in season 2?
I hope they take this whole idea of hextech and this whole democratization of magic like further to some interesting places, where it enables characters to do things they otherwise wouldn't have been able to. We're seeing kind of the prototype version of this in Jace's and Victor's experiments, but we're kind of left like that phase is now behind us, and I kind of want them to find applications in ways that matter to characters and through the story. That's kind of one of the things I would be interested in. And I think a lot of characters in the games use like hex stack devices, so it makes sense for a whole bunch of characters to get those things. And then there's Heimerdinger, who I think we haven't talked about him at all, but he's kind of in exile, right, at the end. And he's kind of well-intentioned, but without a home and without a cause, right? He kind of naively walks into Undercity and wants to help people and is basically told to shove off. And it seems like that's setting him up for something, that he finds somebody who actually wants his help and where he can actually help. And maybe his idea of what helping looks like is maybe changed from what it was at the beginning of season 1, I would assume, because he's kind of seen his dream fail, right? He was one of the founders of Piltover, and he's kind of seen it fail, right? Because like there's different lessons you could draw from it, right? But one idea might be that humans just can't be trusted because they're too, like, there's a few moments in the series where he kind of remarks on, or people remark on the fact that he's long lived and the humans aren't. I think he calls humans impatient at some point, and he says, well, we don't have the luxury to wait for 200 years, right? We have to act now if we want to help people. Like ideas like that were really, really interesting, and I hope they build on that more. Now that kind of the House of Cards has been thrown over, and everybody's kind of finding their new place. So I think you could do some really interesting stuff here.
For sure. Well, I'm very much looking forward to it. I think it comes out November 9th is the first set of episodes, I believe, eagerly anticipating that. And just one more thing that I want to touch on, actually. And this is just me kind of like gushing about the show and just like some of the stuff within it. Of course, we touched on the animation, but one thing to like really shout out about this as well is the music in this. And I know you probably like not as of interest to you guys, but this is probably the first time I've actually gone and listened to the soundtrack of any TV show or movies. It's not really my thing to sort of normally do. And I did watch some of the makings of some of the music, especially the ending of episode 9 and sort of how they did some of the final sort of kind of like set piece when she shoots the rocket at the counselors. And just all of that is just like kind of like masterfully done, especially that they're sort of creating a lot of this music purposely for sort of what's happening in sort of the show. So that's another kind of like well done to sort of the show and sort of the creators for that as well. I think that's everything, unless anyone wants to add anything else.
Just bottom line is, I think watching it for the first time, I got hung up on, like, I'm really into world building, right? And I want to see well-motivated conflicts and stuff like that. And I do think they could have done more on that front. And also there's a whole bunch of lines that are quite cliche, especially in the first 3 episodes. And like just platitudes and stuff like that, that seem like filler a little bit. But now that we've talked about it a little more, I kind of see that there was a little bit more going on. And I think most of that is in the second half, where I could tell that it was getting better. Like I still think the first 3 episodes are not the greatest.
You didn't like episode 3 because that's the one that normally hooks people. Is once it gets
the end of episode 3, the big showdown where Jinx tries to help and it gets out of hand. Yeah, that's where I thought it started to get good. And from episode 4, it kind of felt like a different show, like in terms of its setting and in terms of it, because there's also the time jump, right? So that felt like the beginning of the story kind of to me, and then it just kept getting better from there. So maybe if I know what's coming, I'll have a different experience of the early stuff. And I think like the whole thing about like the cliches and the platitudes kind of goes away as they have established more about these characters. And I don't know if that's because maybe they had some kind of quota to fill in terms of how long the opening sequence has, like the opening act has to be, or that it has to be 3 episodes or whatever. I don't know. But as the series goes on, that stuff kind of fades away and everything is very motivated and characters kind of act in more specific ways and more deliberate ways. And I can kind of appreciate that a little bit more now that I've thought a little bit about it, now that we talked about it. Because watching it, at least like the first half, well, I was not really into it. But as time went on, it got definitely better.
Yeah, I think definitely for sure episodes 1 and 2 do get better on the rewatch in terms of like knowing the characters and knowing sort of what's being set up in the early episodes, and again seeing some of the callbacks that sort of happened from some of the early episodes to the later episodes. I think is definitely better on a second watch, because like I was like you, I watched like first first 2 episodes, and I wasn't completely into the show. I was like kind of like watching it on my phone and stuff like that. And it wasn't until like I got into the late episodes where I was like, okay, I need to go back and like watch this from the start and actually like properly sort of pay attention to what's going on. So yeah, no, for sure.
If you liked what you saw today, like, comment, share, and subscribe to your people. You know what I'm saying? And also let us know what you thought down below of Arcane. And let us know what you're thinking about season 2, what you think is going to happen. And we will catch you next week. Au revoir.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.